From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden opens up a public dispute with Israel, and especially with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over the conduct of Israel's war in Gaza. President Biden even says an attempt to clear Hamas out of the city of Rafah, its last stronghold, would be a red line, quote unquote. What's behind this change of rhetoric and perhaps policy toward Israel inside the White House? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the Potomac Watch podcast here, and with my colleagues Bill McGurn and Kate Batchelder-Odell. So, marked change of tone by the president on Israel, notably starting with his State of the Union address, where he lectured the Israeli leaders on how they are conducting the war. Let's listen.
To the leadership of Israel, I say this: humanitarian assistance cannot be a secondary consideration or a bargaining chip. Protecting and saving innocent lives has to be a priority. As we look to the future, the only real solution to the situation is a two-state solution over time.
Well, Bill, well received that line by the Democrats in the House chamber. What do you make of this shift by Biden? And starting with the State of the Union, where he did criticize Hamas for using civilians as shields, but then I think he devoted more time to criticizing Israel.
Yeah, it's a pattern. He gives a general kind of abstract support for Israel. They have right to defend themselves. But all the concrete criticisms, like of their war strategy, all the demands, what they have to do, they're against Israel, not against Hamas. No call, for example, for Hamas to prove its good faith by releasing all the hostages. You know, that's a war crime, holding hostages, and we don't even mention it. So I think he's looking over his shoulder. It might have been well received by Democrats, but the polls show overwhelming U.S. support for Israel. And the criticism is coming from the campuses, the Free Palestine movement, and the Squad and so forth, all those radical groups. In the editorial today, we call it the Dearborn strategy, after Dearborn, Michigan, where there's a lot of Arab anger at Biden for his policies. And I think that's a real thing. And I think Joe Biden's worried about it. We can see maybe a Democratic convention like Chicago in 1968 with violent anti-war clashes outside with cops while they have a weak candidate fighting for survival inside. So I do think it's an alarming trend by Biden from initial strong rhetorical support for Israel to now making more of the arguments made by Israel's enemies.
Kate, the president of the State of the Union also laid out a new initiative going around Israel to deliver aid to Gaza by sea. He's going to have the U.S. Navy set up a floating pier from which ships could deliver aid to Gaza via the Mediterranean. Pretty extensive effort. It's going to involve something like 1,000 U.S. troops, obviously ships, and maybe even have the capacity to deliver a couple of million meals a day. Will take weeks to set up. What do you make of this effort?
Well, so it's just getting started. And to your point, it'll take some time to get set up. The U.S. Army is lending some logistical transport craft to start to build this pier off Gaza. I do think it is a much riskier proposition than is currently appreciated. At a recent Pentagon briefing, I was really blown away when a reporter asked, well, are you concerned at the Pentagon that Hamas will try to fire on those building this pier and getting aid into Gaza? And General Ryder, who's the Pentagon spokesman, said, well, it's a risk, but if Hamas cares about the Palestinian people, I'm paraphrasing, they wouldn't do that. And I think the conclusion from anyone watching is that they don't care about the Palestinian people. So I found this sort of an alarming response, that the risks of this humanitarian mission have perhaps not fully been thought through before executing it.
Well, that's a really interesting point. Of course, the humanitarian concern is real. The suffering by the Palestinian people in Gaza is real and terrible, and we should all want to do something about it. The problem is that Hamas is the group that doesn't want to do anything about it because the suffering of the Palestinian civilians is the best propaganda weapon it has. And the world is now focused on that. And that's where Hamas wants the world's focus to be. So in that sense, we don't know for sure whether Hamas would even want that kind of aid. I guess it would not rhetorically speak up against it. But on the other hand, if you have American naval personnel and others vulnerable at all there, they could become targets. And the other thing, Kate, I'm just kind of amazed by is there's no focus on Egypt, which is right across the border from Rafah and could allow refugees to flow over, civilian refugees, temporarily in camps, get them to safety. Once the war is over, they could go back. But there's no pressure at all on Egypt from the world or the United States to do that.
No, there's been exactly none. And Egypt, of course, has very closely guarded its border and exit out of Gaza and has not faced the same derision that Israel has for making its border difficult to cross while it's in an active war with Hamas. So that is just part of how Israel is treated when it's fighting these wars. But I think I would also question the premise that's out there from the Biden administration, which is that Israel doesn't want to get aid to Gaza. There have been instances of trying to get trucks into Gaza where the scenes descend into chaos. There have been issues of Hamas diverting this aid to try to keep its own war effort running. To your point, the suffering of Palestinians is terrible, and it should require multiple countries working to try to stop it, but it's not as simple as it might look immediately.